Emanuel Tove is an institution. He's one of the best known and most beloved scholars on the planet. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. Today's podcast is a two-parter. The topic is the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But exactly who were the scribes? When you read the New Testament Gospels, you see the scribes in the story lined up against Jesus. They're often questioning him, testing him, publicly trying to embarrass him. So who are these people? What skills did they have? What agendas did they have? Were these the quiet, sort of sit in the background kind of people, or were they more used to being out there in front, in public debates and dialogues? Well, Emanuel Tove has been studying these questions and others like them for years through the scrolls of the Judean desert. He and his wife, Lika, are in residence at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center right now. In the middle of the 20th century, Bedouins and archaeologists discovered caves near the Dead Sea where they found thousands of handwritten scrolls and fragments. These were part of a 2,000-year-old Jewish library of biblical and sectarian books. Somebody wrote and copied these scrolls, and these were the scribes. We're going to find out more about them with Professor Emanuel Tove of the Hebrew University on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
I'm Emanuel Tove, J.L. Magnus Professor of Bible at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel.
Dr. Emanuel Tove, Emanuel, good to see you back here at the Lanier Theological Library. Welcome. You've been on the Stone Chapel Podcast before.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being back here. Nice weather and excellent library. I'm glad to do my research here again, back with nice people.
Well, you're working on a book that we'll be talking about a little bit later, and you're giving a lecture here on April the 5th, 2025, on the Scribes of Qumran. And I asked you if we could do a little bit of a primer to talk about what you're going to be talking about, to encourage people to come and join us. But for those who maybe will hear it after the lecture, they can find the video online on our YouTube channel, and they'll be able to listen for themselves.
Okay, so I'll be talking about the Scribes of Qumran, or the Scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, some of you may not know exactly what I mean by scribes, because the word scribes has a different meaning today and in the Middle Ages and in ancient times. I'm talking about scribes in ancient times, more or less in the times of Jesus. Now, scribes are not the scribes that you may be used to in the New Testament. These scribes are scribes more or less of a political nature, a political unit. The scribes I talk about are scribes that do a job. They are copyists. They copy a text. They sat on their chairs and they copied on their laps or something like a desk, and they had in front of them a text from which they copied, and they copied that text into a new text. So they created a new text from an old text. You might say some of them also created a completely new text without a text in front of them. All these people are called scribes. There are really several types of scribes, and of course they don't exist only in the world about which I made my study, the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They exist in ancient Mesopotamia, They exist in particular in ancient Egypt, where we even have depictions of these scribes. They're very famous. You can see the Egyptian scribes sitting on the ground and writing on their laps. You see these depictions in various museums. They're very famous, these scribes. Now, exactly how the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls were sitting, we don't know, but there's one spot in the place of Qumran near the Dead Sea. We call this the scriptorium, a room in Qumran. We call this the room number 30, where we found inkwells, as well as tables, what we call tables and benches. And we think that is in this particular place, some scribes, let's say some 30 scribes, were seated in a room. Some scholars say that they were dictated, but I don't believe in the theory of dictation. I think many scribes were seated in this room, and they had enough room on these tables to spread out pieces of leather, because you need a lot of room in order to have your piece of leather in front of you, and there they wrote their new creations, scrolls, because at that time we didn't have yet the book form of written creations. The book form was only created afterwards with the promulgation of Christian scriptures. So we are talking about the form that we are used to until today in the Jewish synagogue, the ancient roll or scroll. That is, pieces of leather which were sewn together, connected, not glued, but sewn together with strings. And these scribes, certain techniques about which we can talk later on, and they did a wonderful job. And from their job, we can learn manifold things, not only about the scribes, but also about the creations, that is, the books themselves, that they copied, that they created.
Now, when you say Qumran, there are a lot of people that say, well, okay, I think I know something about that, but maybe they've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. But when you say the scribes of Qumran, were these all copyists associated with the Qumran group, with that particular group, or were they hired out to do this job?
There is no real archaeological information about the scrolls or the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everything we know is by inferring data from the scrolls, by a thorough study that we have done over the course of now half a century. So everything is theory. In the beginning, when the scrolls were found in 1947, 1948, people thought that all these scrolls found at Qumran, at the shore of the Dead Sea, a dry region, were actually copied on the spot. Now we have become more wise, and according to my own theory, 1/3 of the scrolls that were found near the Dead Sea were copied on the spot, and 2/3 were imported by the people who lived in Qumran from outside Qumran. So when we talk about the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's a little bit misleading, because these are really not the scribes of Qumran, but these are the scribes of ancient Israel, of ancient Palestine, that we get to know from this wonderful treasure of scrolls that were found at Qumran. It's the whole world of ancient Israel that we learn from these scrolls that were found at one spot.
Emanuel, earlier you mentioned that the scribes are writing on leather. What kind of leather are they writing on?
To be a scribe is a big business. If you're an apprentice scribe, you have to learn a lot. And I've been thinking a lot about this. In the beginning, when I started my study, maybe this was 25 years ago, I thought that the scribes actually performed all the tasks connected with the writing on material themselves. But in the course of the years, I've come to the conclusion that another stage must be suggested before that of the scribe, namely that of a scroll manufacturer. Now, this is just a suggestion, because there's no way that we can prove this suggestion. But in my lecture, I will talk a little bit more about this. I think that the very technical aspects of the preparation of the material for the writing were performed by a person that we shall call a scroll manufacturer. He had a kind of a store, a shop, and it was he who took the hides, the skins of the animals. Now, mind you, we're still in the middle of research. I can't tell you exactly, and we would like to know this, from which animals the skins, we say leather, but it's really, leather is the finished product. It's more like skin-based products, sometimes leather, were made. It's an ibis, it's calf. There are different options, and we have some research, but we would like to have a database for all the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In my mind, the most beautiful material for any scroll is that of the Temple Scroll. Beautiful, white, skin-like material, written in this case on the flesh side of the material. All the other scrolls were written on the hair side. Now, because you can imagine that the skin has two sides. Now, the skins were taken from animals, and they had different sizes. They were, of course, dried. They were prepared with chemicals. It must not have been pleasant for the nose, this process, so it would not have been in the middle of a settlement. When they were dried and were ready for writing on, the manufacturer, thus I surmise, made different columns, because the writing was in columns. And he made the preparations for a height of different columns, let's say normally would be 3, 4, 5 different columns next to each other, and he used a grid in order to make the lines of each column. And sometimes these lines were precisely next to each other, and sometimes they were not exactly precise. You can see this when you have a long scroll like the Temple Scroll. These were the major items that a manufacturer prepared, and then the scribe who wanted to write a scroll, a small scroll or a long scroll, went to the manufacturer, and sometimes strange things happen because I can see that in a certain case, for example in the Pesher, the commentary on Habakkuk, the second sheet of this commentary has margins, but these margins had lines, ruled lines. Well, you don't need ruled lines in a margin. That's funny. So my suggestion is that the scribe of this scroll went to the store. He ordered material for his scroll, and the manufacturer said, "Sorry, sir, I don't have this for this small size, but I have something larger, but it's already ruled for a larger scroll, so you can use it." And he used it, and it so happened that it was appropriate for him, but the margins were already ruled for a larger scroll. So he used it. So in this exceptional case, you have margins with ruled lines in it and no writing in the margins, because that's, of course, not needed. Then the scribe had all the material in front of him, and he could start writing. And then, of course, this apprentice scribe had to learn many, many details that we today learn when we go to grade 1 at school. But he had to learn those. I say he because I don't think there was a she. Had to learn before actually writing a scroll of, let's say, the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1.
So they're writing on this leather material. Their scroll manufacturer has created the scroll itself. Where do they get the ink to write?
The scribe had to learn many, many things. Creating the ink is also one of the things that he had to learn. It's just a thought, but I don't know. I think that the scribe did this himself. And there has been some research in the last 30 years of the ink, because you have two possibilities about ancient ink. I didn't do this research myself, this is for chemists. So you can have ink with a metal basis, and you can have ink based on plants that you burn, and with the soot as the soot basis, you can make ink. Well, first of all, amazingly, after 2,000 years, this ink is still beautiful, being beautifully preserved as if it was created yesterday. This ink, we still have some inkwells, about 10 different inkwells, and a few inkwells have some remains in them, so we can do research on them. Now, interestingly enough, there are about 10 scrolls that have the letters negatively written in the scroll. Now, what do I mean by negative? If you have a letter, say, let's say the Aleph, let's say the English letter A, the ink has eaten through the material. That's not very helpful. It's ugly, but we can still read the letter. But the letters, and this happens, for example, in the Genesis Apocryphon scroll, eats through the material. This happens with certain type of ink. In the beginning, we thought this was with metal-based ink, but now we think this is actually the copper element. And it's the copper element that was created by a copper inkwell. And so that's all what these scrolls that have letters eaten through the scroll have in common. very interestingly. And as I said, the scribes had to learn many additional things before they were able to write the scrolls in different levels of expertise.
I always enjoy any time I spend with Emanuel Tove. He is an amazing scholar and an all-around great human being. The Stone Chapel podcast is part of the Church Leaders podcast network. We are dedicated to providing resources for church leaders who want to dig deep into Scripture and theology, so that's why we're here. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Thanks to my wife, Kathy Capes, for editing this podcast, providing the transcript. Thanks to Jana Firestone and Jessica Mauser for their help in producing this podcast as well. Thanks always to Phil Kagi and to David Capes for our music. Part 2 of our podcast with Emanuel Tove is just 168 hours away. Give us a 5-star rating in the meantime, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss one episode of the Stone Chapel podcast. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks.